Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Arashi wash processed Ecuador from H&S Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And H&S, based out of Laramie, Wyoming. And once again, they were a suggestion to us by Mac and Devon Greer. So shout out to and thank you to both of you for the suggestion. This is H&S's second ever appearance on this channel, having recently reviewed the Mi Mundo, a honey processed Honduran coffee. And in that video, I mentioned that we'd also purchased a wash processed coffee from H&S, and that is this one right here, as it is yet another Abel Salinas Mejorado coffee. So that definitely caught my interest, and I'm certainly looking forward to discussing it, as this right here is day 39. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I actually like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So I do have it listed as an ultra light, and you can definitely tell that this is one of the lighter roasted versions of the Abel Salinas coffees that we have reviewed, and one of the lightest roasted coffees that we have reviewed from any American coffee roaster. So you could definitely say that this one skews on the very light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and interestingly enough, the cup offered immense sweetness right off brew, as there was an abundance of the Mejorado-like brown candy characteristics that was very much in line with the listed marshmallow, as it was essentially sugar. There was a little bit of fruit brightness in line with the listed pair as well, lending itself to a very good start, as I was really impressed by this coffee. That's not usually the case I have with Mejorado coffees, as they aren't usually that sweet from that first try, and I was just really stunned by how sweet this coffee was and how intense this coffee was. We move on to day 18 as we opted for the Chemex, and it continues to offer immense Mejorado-like sweetness right off brew, as there's an abundance of these sugary aspects yet again with plenty of fruit brightness. It was slightly more toned down in this brewer, but it was still a very nice cup of coffee, so enjoyed this second impression as well. We continue on to day 21 as we opted for the April brewer, and the cup has been very consistent up to this point, as there's more of the strong sugary sweetness yet again. There's great intensity to the cup, as the sweetness is absolutely dominating yet again, followed by the listed pear-like acidity with a slight bit of an herbal florality as well, with the entire cup offering a very Mejorado-like experience all around. So these first three impressions, I said, this is everything I was hoping for and expecting of this coffee, and I'm just really stunned by the way that this coffee is. And here's where things get kind of interesting, because here's where we start to tinker. And on day 24, we opted for the V60 with H&S's recipe. And once again, just like with the Mi Mundo, I felt that this coffee was very diluted and toned down, as a lot of the cup felt on the more soft and subtle side of things. The sweetness is still high and a little bit more even, which is kind of interesting, because the intensity of the first couple of days was maybe a little bit more than I was hoping for, as it just felt slightly more even in that sense. The herbal florals were coming through a little bit more in the finish. Better as it cooled down. It was still a nice cup, but I couldn't help but shake the feeling that it's not quite the same coffee. It's lost a lot of the wild intensity and the wild sweetness that it had from that first couple of days. So we continue on to day 27 with the Chemex and H&S's recipe, and I had very mixed feelings on it, as it continues to feel very toned down relative to some of the earlier experience. It continues to open up as it does cool down, but outside of that, it's not necessarily the same coffee. Still sugary, still a little bit of that lingering herbality, but outside of that, I do have to say that it just turned into a much more diluted and less intense version of the initial experiences. Day 30, back through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it was near the same level of sweetness and intensity as our first impression of it, as there were plenty of sugary aspects to the cup. Once again, in line with that listed marshmallow-like aspect to it, and I've said before that people have different ways that they want to describe that Mejorado-like sweetness, and I always say brown candy sweetness, mostly because it just kind of reminds me of just a caramelized sugariness to it. And in this case, it once again is definitely still present within its florality, has become a little bit more pronounced as well, especially within the finish, as the entire cup is offering just a lingering, long-lasting sugariness to it. And that's been my experience with a lot of Mejorado coffees, is that they're just essentially very sweet sugar to them. Day 33 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and this was the best experience I had had since our first couple of days, as there's much more of the brown candied sweetness yet again, floral herbality yet again. There is a slight graininess causing the cup to be a little reminiscent of Fruit Loops and Lucky Charms, and I did have to say that works for me. I really like when I get that kind of sugary cereal-like sweetness to the cup. A bit of the pear apple brightness yet again, but this day was actually a little bit more straightforward, as I felt like this coffee definitely was hitting on a lot of the notes that I was looking for, and that's why we settled on the Chemex, and that's why we went back to it on day 36 with our standard recipe, as it was finally offering a little bit more consistency, as it was similar to the previous day. And once again, I just ran out of space for our notes. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so let's go through that one real quick, and it won't come as a surprise to anybody that it is the sweetness out of level 5. And I still have a little bit of this coffee left, and so much of me is tempted to just go back and push this one as much as possible, because I'm very curious to see what might change if we decided to ramp it up and go really fine, brew it at higher temperatures. But either way, the sweetness was an ever-present within this one, as it was right off the bat, and then even with any sort of adjustments made, it still remained extremely sweet. Even with that very diluted recipe, it still offered just tremendous sweetness. So level 5, no surprise whatsoever. And I think if we're kind of comparing it side by side, I could say that it was even a little sweeter than some of the other Abel Salinas coffees that we had had. So massive credit to them on that, at least. We move on to a handful of level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness. Level 4 is probably one of the most important things I do have to say about this coffee, and I think it has a lot to do with the way that this coffee was roasted. This is probably one of the cleaner versions of the Abel Salinas coffees that we have had, as I feel like there's really nice definition to a lot of the aspects in it, and that's why I didn't necessarily feel a need to go too much in depth on them, mostly because the clarity was just tremendous. And it's very rare that I've actually never scored a Mejorado coffee at level 5 in terms of the cleanliness, but I do have to say this is one of the cleanest versions of this coffee that I've had, any Mejorado coffee that I've had. So massive credits to them. I think that the roast profile did seem to help in terms of the overall clarity on this one. Finish level 4, yeah, it does have that very lingering, long-lasting, sugary sweetness to it, but in addition to that, there's a very interesting herbal aspect, and I think they have a orchid note list on here. Makes a lot of sense. I do get a lot of florality from these Mejorado coffees as well. Oftentimes, it's definitely taking a backseat to the intense sugary sweetness, as this one was, though it was still never present within this coffee. Citrus fruit, level 4, and that's going to be the best place to put that kind of apple pear brightness, as it's the best place to put it on the tasting wheel in general. We move on, caramel level 4. Of course, that is the Mejorado like brown candied aspect, and once again they have marshmallow listed on here. It's sugar, regardless of how you kind of slice it, it's sugar, and it's just once again a very, very sugary cup of coffee right from start to finish, and that's the best place I wanted to categorize it, because it is, as I just generally like to describe it, Mejorado sweetness. It has this very unique, just different sweetness that these coffees tend to have that I don't experience or haven't really experienced from any other varietals out there. We move on to the one level 3 that we do have. It is the acidity level 3. And I do have to say that this one may have offered a slight bit more brightness. I've had this discussion with some, we'll just say coffee roaster owners, about the brightness of Mejorado coffees, as it's not necessarily something that's often felt. It's not something that's easily obtainable. But this one, I do have to say, higher side of level 3, lower side of level 4, there's a little bit more brightness to this one, and once again, I think that could be attributed to the profile of this coffee. We move on. I wanted to discuss this real quick, because the stone fruit, I do have a level 2, but as I'm drinking this today, I could say maybe a little bit closer to that level 3. I think that there's a slight bit more peachiness to it. It's not something I mentioned throughout the notes itself, but it's something I kind of noticed at the later parts of this coffee, and it's something that's opening up a little bit more. So I just wanted to make that one note, because we do have it here on a level 2. So I'd have to say towards some of the later days, I could probably bump that up ever so slightly to that level 3 mark. And then final thing worth discussing is the body at the level 2. And it's once again something that's been kind of consistent with Mejorado coffees. They don't necessarily have the most amount of body or texture to them. This one, especially being brewed with the Chemex, didn't necessarily seem to signal that either. And kind of going back to that Mi Mundo review, that's why I said in that review that it was interesting to me, one, that the sweetness was at a level 4 for that one, mostly because this one was so much sweeter than that coffee, and the body for both these coffees was at a level 2, because I said the texture of body to both these coffees is actually just about the same at that level 2 mark. So that's why I made a huge note of it in that one. But as we're discussing this tasting wheel, it was relevant to this one as well, and I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting for this coffee. All right, So my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Once again, I feel like this would have been a lot better had I not messed around with H&S's recipe once again. I'm still kind of perplexed by the route that they went to go with, because to me, it just seems so drastic. It seems so different. And as somebody that says, okay, I don't necessarily believe that too much of an adjustment on the recipe is going to change that much about the coffee. When you go that extreme, yeah, you're definitely going to experience a huge and dramatic change in the coffee overall. But kind of going back to it and getting it back on track really did seem to do wonders for this coffee, and having a little bit more to play around with could continue to lead this coffee in the right direction, mostly because the first couple of tries I had of this one, I said, this is a strong contender for my favorite coffee of the entire year. This is a strong contender for my favorite Mejorado coffee of the entire year. And then from that point going forward, I was just trying to get this coffee back to a level of consistency. And I feel like I kind of lost a couple of days by pursuing the recipe that they did have. But I did have to give it kind of a fair shake and try it their way. And I'm still not entirely sure what happened on those days, but kind of circling back to it and getting it at a point that I did enjoy. I think it still could have been one of my favorite coffees that we've had this entire year, but I unfortunately think that the inconsistencies I'd had, given that I had adjusted so heavily in so many directions to kind of see what I could get from this coffee, might have just hindered my overall experience with it. At its very best, this is one of my favorite coffees of the entire year, but overall the consistency issues just seem to kind of hold it back from being in that very truly elite category. Though, once again, if I had an entire bag to play with this coffee, I feel like I could get it right and maybe really enjoy this one equally to or more than any other coffee that I've had this year. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, if you really enjoy your Mejorado coffees, then I think this one's a really nice standout because it offered the sweetness right off the bat. You don't really need to tinker with this coffee. I feel like maybe I was tinkering with it a little bit too much to try to get it to a point where it didn't need to go. Just kind of brew it with a very simple recipe, and I think you can just experience a lot of the characteristics that they're going for in this one. Mostly the sweeter aspects to it, that sugary aspect, and then in addition to that, you get some fun florals and some interesting brightness to the cup as well, just giving it a little bit more depth in general. And at times I was able to experience a little bit more of that kind of sugary, grainy, cereal-like aspect too. So if you can unlock a little bit more of those, then I feel like this one could be a true gem for you as well. Also keep in mind the very light profile of this coffee, but I think for the most part that's the best way to leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Arashi wash processed Ecuador from H&S Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.